Welcome to the Significance of Wealth podcast, where we explore the evolving landscape of wealth management, private investments, and collecting as both a passion and an investment strategy. I'm Marty Salt, and today's guest started deploying capital for a single-family office at the age of 24. He now runs his own fund. Daniel Kleinmann is the co-founder and general partner of Balerion Space Ventures, a Dallas-based firm backing the companies building the new space economy, from launch and propulsion to Earth observation and dual-use defense technology. Before Balerion, he was a founding principal at Explorer One Fund, and earlier built the venture strategy and direct investment program inside a single-family office. He's worked both sides of the table, the family deciding where its capital goes, and the investor asking for it. Today, Daniel joins Tom to talk about how you back a category before anyone else calls it one. They get into what a newly public SpaceX still has to prove, the moon as the center of a new race with China, the nuclear build-out the AI boom is forcing, and the bigger idea behind all of it, which is moving critical infrastructure off Earth. And now here's your host, Tom Ruggie.
Tom Ruggie here with another edition of The Significance of Wealth. Today I have with me Daniel Kleinmann. Excited to have him. I actually have been following his and his company's newsletter for a number of years, which we'll delve into, along with a topic that a lot of people are talking about today, SpaceX, but we're going to get maybe even a little bit deeper than SpaceX and the space exploration topic. With that, Daniel, pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being on the pod with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah. So would love to hear a little bit about, the path. You worked with a single family office. We run a multifamily office. You've gone a different direction and now very focused in, what I think is just one of the most exciting sectors out there. But again, would love to hear more about what got you from point A to point B.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me today. My story kind of starts back in, I kind of grew up between New York, Israel, and Canada, did my undergraduate studies in Canada. And from there, went over to Israel to work in kind of the tech ecosystem, working for startups, scouting technologies, and then got into business school. And kind of post business school in New York, I was very fortunate to meet a gentleman who asked me to kind of join his family office and help build out his venture strategy. And at the time I inherited sort of a bespoke venture strategy that kind of spread out into different opportunities. And I kind of helped build from the ground up, like a multi-channel deal sourcing engine, both at the fund and direct level. And by doing so, I was spending a lot of time in Silicon Valley. This is around like 2017, 2018, 2019. And I was attending Y Combinator, if you're familiar with Y Combinator, sort of the marquee kind of accelerator incubator in Silicon Valley, where most of the tier one VC firms kind of attend. At the time, it was twice a year. You'd have kind of 400 or 500 startups appear in demo days and kind of present. And it was, both an incredible place to source opportunities. Companies like Airbnb have kind of come from it, and Stripe and the likes. But it was also a great kind of litmus test to see what Silicon Valley and the venture capital community was willing to fund. And around 2018, I started seeing more and more space companies attend these demo days. And I remember the first one I attended, there was none. The second batch I attended, there was one that I remembered, and then it was like 3, and then 7. And then I kind of pumped the brakes and said, something's going on here. And through that, I started doing more and more research, and I was very fortunate to, through my research and networking, meet my now 2 co-founders at Balerion, a guy named Phil Scully and Dan Wollman. Phil's background is kind of like myself, come from financial services, having worked at places like the Capital Group companies, mostly doing equity research at the institutional investor level. And then our other partner, Dan Wollman, who's an aerospace engineer by training. Dan worked at places like Boeing in a special group there called Phantom Works, doing like rapid prototyping for the U.S. government on unique projects before they kind of get picked up by the primes, and then worked under Bezos at Blue Origin doing propulsion and government related work. And so the 3 of us connected back in 2020. And we really had this thesis that, launch had effectively been solved for due to SpaceX achieving reusability and seeing kind of the ramp up of launch cadence of Falcon 9. And we were seeing more and more assets get sent to space. But the underlying infrastructure and supply chain that, was supposed to basically support these assets going to orbit was just, to us, not sufficiently built out or modern enough to really help scale commercial space. And so we came together with this thesis that, let's kind of map out every kind of sub vertical that represented the value chain of space. And let's identify the areas that we believe have the largest near-term revenue opportunities, and then go identify the companies that we believe would be the category winners. And that was back in 2020. Obviously, over the last five and a half.
I would consider that, at least from my own personal path, kind of way ahead of the curve. I can't imagine that there was, aside from SpaceX, which even in 2020, I mean, SpaceX wasn't anything near what it is today from a common knowledge standpoint. I mean, you guys are just way ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it was crazy to start a space fund in the middle of COVID in 2020. We were seen as kind of cowboys, if you will, and kind of out there. But I think too, like, my partners and our credit, like, we kind of saw the fundamental picture play out where there was real revenue opportunities, a lot of it from the US government, a lot of it from satellite communication that was being won, and companies were really generating revenue. And so we kind of pulled on that thread. And then obviously over the last 5.5 years, what's really panned out and helped the category is these major kind of geopolitical events that have acted as like major macro tailwinds to the category, whether it be, the war is unfortunately breaking out, but defense budgets increasing dramatically, the Chinese emerging as a massive threat and sort of main competitor to the US, and now a sort of a new space race with the US versus the Chinese, the emergence of Golden Dome, and lastly, the AI race that's ushered in a new nuclear renaissance. And so we've really been hyper focused on where revenue has gone to up and down the value chain as a result of these macro trends. And that's been kind of the core thesis of ours from an investment standpoint over the last 5 years.
Yeah. Elon is such a visionary. And again, talk about being so far ahead of the time. But, as you're well aware, in fact, probably some of what I'm talking about, I might have extracted from your newsletters. But, I mean, Elon's got pretty big plans for, kind of the new frontier of what space is going to be made available for, from, whether it's doing something on Mars, whether it's obviously, heavy in the launching the satellites. I also continue to hear a trend of thought of space being where, some of the data centers, the data components for AI is ultimately going to be for various reasons, including resources and whatnot. Where are you looking on a go forward basis? Like, when I looked at even SpaceX 6, 7 years ago, to me, that was just almost otherworldly, some of the things that were being talked about. And now so much has come to fruition. And I think for a lot of people, and to some extent, even myself, probably where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years is almost hard to imagine or fathom. But, would love some insights on that from your perspective.
Absolutely. Maybe it can help kind of provide a framework. This is what we use internally as we think about investing, and it's kind of been our framework that we've used over the last 6 years to help navigate kind of the opportunity set from an investment standpoint. But I think it touches on kind of how you navigate the future of space. To us, everything really starts with transportation. So think about launch vehicles that are putting assets into orbit. If you were to kind of parse that out even further and kind of subsegment out, you've got these heavy launch vehicles that look like Starship that are sort of the 18-wheelers. You've got the small sat launch providers, which are kind of the sprinter vans, and then you've got everything in between. Those are putting assets into orbit, and those assets look for, the vast majority are communication satellites. So Starlink-like systems providing internet from space to Earth globally. That's 90% of the assets that are being sent to space. Some of the others include, imaging satellites, both for government and civil purposes. You've got private space stations. You've got in-space manufacturing. So actually sending up capsules into orbit that are manufacturing things and bringing it back down. And then I think some of the, future opportunities look like orbital data centers. Kind of moving on, you've got all the subcomponents that kind of make up a satellite. Think about like the actual chassis of a satellite or the bus, they call it, the subcomponents like power and communications and such. You've got all the in-space infrastructure that supports these assets. So moving stuff between different orbits, refueling these satellites. You've got the ground-based infrastructure that brings the data and offloads the data to the ground stations. Then kind of moving a little bit further out, you've got the lunar economy. And that looks like landing on the moon, setting up critical kind of power and communications infrastructure on the moon, and then eventually mining the lunar surface for, precious metals or things like helium-3. And then you've really got like the supply chains that feed into everything. That looks like propulsion systems, propellants, power, so nuclear, solar, advanced manufacturing, and then even the raw inputs. And so that is the value chain as we see it today. I think what ends up happening is as additional launch capacity comes online and launch prices come down, you'll see that value chain evolve to things like, the Martian economy, to mining asteroids, to, to applications that we can't think of today, but will come online as a result of that. We've really, as I kind of mentioned earlier, hyper-focused on specific parts of these from what we believe is like investable and others are not today, but that's the framework we use.
Yeah, no, who owns that space? I mean, you've mentioned the rush to the space, sounds like primarily between us and China. I'm sure we're not obviously the only countries that are looking at that, but I've heard a lot about mining the moon as an example. And in all likelihood, we're going to find elements on the moon that are not on the Earth, and we're going to find elements that, can be beneficial and solve problems and whatnot. But again, who owns that space? How does that work from a standpoint of multiple countries looking to do the same thing?
Yeah, it's like a very deep philosophical legal question that I think we could probably spend a week trying to answer. But the simple answer to that is who owns the moon? Humankind owns the moon. And then from a practical standpoint, it's effectively who can defend it. And so I think if you think about the moon as effectively a land grab right now, you've got the Chinese and the US rushing to the moon to establish an infrastructure. And then what prevents potentially the Chinese from encroaching on your mining territory? Well, it'd probably be deterrence from a military standpoint. And in the same way, the US Navy has for decades kind of created stability on the ocean fronts for global trade to flow freely. I think the same thing we believe will be true in space. But it is a bit of a wild, wild west moment right now where if you can get there, it's sort of yours.
And you'd also mentioned earlier defense. Is there anything that is public knowledge that is being utilized from a space perspective for defense mechanisms?
Yeah, that's basically what Golden Dome is. You can think of it sort of like, the war fighter and the theaters of war have kind of gone from, on land to sea to air to cyber, and now they're just moving to space. And space provides a strategic high ground, and he who has the high ground has the advantage in warfare. But Golden Dome is basically taking our missile defense capabilities and moving them to space to create deterrence against ICBMs, which are intercontinental ballistic missiles that may be launched from our adversaries at the United States. Israel has Iron Dome, which most people know of, and that is a ground-to-air missile defense system which prevents, missiles coming in at a certain range. That would not really be effective for the United States just because of how vast the land is. You couldn't line up our coastlines with Iron Dome batteries. What you'd need to do is basically move those to space. And the premise of and the architecture proposed of Golden Dome is a couple thousand satellites operating in low Earth orbit or in space, majority of them being threat detection. So imaging satellites that are looking for a heat signature from a known ICBM launch site from places like North Korea or China or Russia. And then once those missiles are detected as being launched at the United States, those missiles have to travel basically such long distances that they enter space and then they come back down. And when they enter space, you would have space-based interceptors, which effectively would act like golden Iron Dome batteries on Earth to intercept those ICBMs in orbit. And that is a lot more effective. And if you can get the cost down a lot cheaper to defend the United States and ideally create deterrence where it doesn't really make sense to launch nuclear warheads and ICBMs in the United States. So space is just a different domain for our national security infrastructure, mostly at the missile defense level.
Pretty fascinating.
There's a
I
great
talk.
movie, by the way, Tom. There's a movie called
Yeah,
There's a
okay.
movie called Dynamite, if you've ever seen it on Netflix. And basically, if you watch it, I think it helps exemplify the need for a Golden Dome-like system.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely check that out. There's a lot of talk, and I read and listen to a lot about what we've been calling the AI race, and I think it's still highly believed that we're ahead of China in the AI race, although not by very much. I think we're fortunate to be in the situation that we are, that we can even be ahead because, as you know, there's a lot of headwinds for some of what's going on. But, again, my philosophy is if we don't win the AI race, then China does. And what's the impact of that for us long term? From a defense standpoint, like you were talking about, where would you suggest we are in, if we want to call that a race as well?
Yeah. On the AI front, I think China's, I think incredibly competitive to us, if not slightly ahead or slightly behind. The way we view the AI race is really a function of power and the need for power to be put online to help facilitate compute capability and then eventually AI.
But that's where I would feel we're behind there, personally, from, again, my
We
understanding.
we are, I guess, technically currently because of you look at the amount of nuclear power that China is putting online on an annual basis versus us, we're
Mhm.
dramatically behind. But I think this administration has done a really good job of changing kind of policy and bureaucracy to enable a new nuclear renaissance. There was an executive order signed last May by this administration that effectively selected a handful of nuclear startups and tasked them to build a reactor that would be approved by the Department of Energy in an expedited manner, and then have that reactor basically be turned online and produce heat eventually to produce electricity and power by July 4th this year. And four companies achieved that goal. And so I think and now in the market, we're seeing billions of dollars being raised by these companies to go and really start scaling and manufacturing these small modular nuclear reactors on the fission side to produce power for data centers and our needs on the national security front. So I would say we were behind on the nuclear side. I think that the optimist view moving forward is that the incentive structures have been changed and are now in place to help kind of capitalism do its thing and catch up.
That's good to hear. I'm going to start back from the beginning just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about you and your path. And then I do want to get into a specific SpaceX conversation, understanding there's certain things you're not really at liberty to talk about. And then finally get into more of a forward thinking thesis and what you all are looking at. The first part is a large part of your career started in a single family office space. What led you to make adjustments in your career from what you were doing there, which was probably a pretty cool gig, got you into Silicon Valley, had you looking at and doing cool stuff. But what was the transition that led to where you are today? And what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, I had an incredible opportunity and very fortunate family that I worked with provided me at a young age of 24 to be able to start basically deploying capital for a family, and these unique opportunities at the venture side was rare. I think for me, it was an opportunity that was too big to miss out on. I think I kind of viewed it as analogous to the beginning of the internet, where
I do
computers
as
were
well, by the way. I use that example all the time.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was like computers used to be the size of the rooms we're sitting in, and the cost to compute was incredibly high. And then we saw like the miniaturization of hardware, advancements in sort of compute and underlying infrastructure, the emergence of the internet and sort of the advancements in the internet infrastructure, and then the sort of the rise of the applications that came on top of that. And as I kind of look today at the biggest companies in the world from a market cap standpoint, I think they all can be traced back to sort of this key inflection point over maybe a 15 to 20-year period where we saw the cost of compute come down, and these companies kind of emerged as either the infrastructure layer category winners or the application layer category winners. And I think as a venture investor, you're always looking for those unique moments in time where you can identify kind of a changing landscape that may produce the biggest companies in the world 20 years from now. And to me, that's what was happening in space in 2018, 2019, 2020 today. That made me say, hey, this is a kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity to invest in truly a transformational asset class that has the potential to produce what will become the biggest companies in the world. And the analogy there is, instead of the cost of compute coming down, it's the cost of launch, and the launch prices coming down, enabling the infrastructure build out in space and eventually the application layer in space. And so I think it took a little bit of time to come to that realization, but once I did, I kind of had full conviction. I was incredibly fortunate to have partners in Phil and Dan to kind of share that vision and push each other to building the firm we have today. A lot of growth still to be had, though.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you're a young guy. You've got an amazing story already. So, congratulations on where you are. Again, obviously, I'm sure you're going to continue to, pardon the pun, but keep going up and up and up. So let's talk about SpaceX for a few minutes. I would imagine we have a lot of listeners that are investors in SpaceX. We had the privilege to have early access as a private company to SpaceX, as I am quite sure you did as well for your investors. Now they're public, just had their first earnings release, and it's gone from 135 to 225 down to 110. And the first tranche is getting released for the 20% of the insiders. So there's a lot going on there. I still can't help but marvel at, just in my span of, above average knowledge of what's going on with SpaceX, where they were 4 or 5 years ago when we first started looking at them, and again, what Elon's vision has been and what he's been able to execute on. And of course, he's just so forward thinking. I know you're somewhat limited on what you can talk about, but what can you share about SpaceX from, the historical vetting and investments that you made to kind of where they are today and perhaps where they're going?
Sure. I think best to kind of go back to the framework that I described earlier in the value chain, and to understand kind of where SpaceX competes within the category. SpaceX today really has the majority of the market share in launch and in, communication satellites in orbit. They don't do much in observation, if really anything. They don't do much on sort of the infrastructure in orbit or on the ground. They don't, they have not really gone after the moon and sort of the infrastructure layer. Now they've got lunar landers that they're going after, and then they're making a big push now, sort of forward looking into orbital data center satellites. On the launch side, they've got the Falcon 9, which is the best performing rocket ever built, doing anywhere from 150 to 200 launches a year, which is incredible. Which is partially reusable, meaning they can bring back the booster, but not the upper stage. And then they have the development of Starship, which is a massive launch vehicle. I mean, this thing's 42 stories high. It's like basically a skyscraper that gets launched into orbit and that can re-land partially. Today, they've got about, I think the latest numbers are close to 13,000 or 12,000 active Starlink satellites in orbit, charging kind of on average about $120 a month for internet. Any given Falcon 9 can launch about anywhere from 20 to 25 Starlink satellites on a single launch. I think what's compelling about the future of SpaceX and I think the lever here is really Starship, is that if Starship can come online, they can launch anywhere from maybe 250 to 300 satellites at a given time. So 10xing the number of satellites they can put in orbit. If they've got plans to put up another 30,000 satellites of Starlink and to have basically complete global coverage with about a constellation of 40 to 50,000 satellites in space. If they can do that and they can take kind of their global subscriber base from 12 or 13 million to 100 million, I think you see a path to a business that can generate 100 to 150 billion in revenue annually. And I think the question really is, how long will it take them to get the rest of the satellites up, and how long will it take them to get that subscriber and user base up? Up until that Super Bowl ad, they had never spent money on advertisements. So I think the IPO and the capital that kind of they raised from that, a lot of it is going into the development of Starship and getting it online and sort of fully retired from a technical standpoint, and then building up their user base. And I think, the question is really how quickly can they get to 100 million users? That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, amazing company. You've talked a little bit also about what is beyond and some of the other sectors. What are your thoughts on some of the other sectors within let's call it the space exploration space?
Sure. So I think infrastructure in space is an incredibly exciting area for us. There's a company specifically called Impulse Space that I think kind of exemplifies this opportunity. Impulse was started by a guy named Tom Mueller. Tom was the first employee at SpaceX. He was the CTO of propulsion there for 18 and a half years. He designed and developed the propulsion systems that power SpaceX today. He left with the goal to basically pick up where SpaceX drops off, both from a figurative and literal sense, which is SpaceX puts stuff into low Earth orbit. Once they're in low Earth orbit, how do you get them to their desired orbits in LEO, MEO, or GEO, which might take upwards of, 10 months to get there. And so they are basically doing the orbital transfer layer, the in-space transportation, in-space propulsion capabilities. And to us, that is the next layer that is required in space to make commercial space economy kind of flourish. We've got to the new world with the ships. Now we need to build, the railways. We need to build the highway systems. We need to allow us to sort of build out an infrastructure to get to and from the moon or to and from sun synchronous orbits, to put orbital data centers and build out those constellations. So I think the infrastructure layer in orbit is incredibly exciting to us from an investment standpoint. Impulse Space has had now multiple successful missions. It's, on pace to be one of the largest companies in the category. Beyond that, I think the moon is incredibly exciting. The moon is kind of the heart of the new space race against the Chinese, where they've got nuclear powered rovers prospecting deposits to bring back and trying to eventually mine the moon. And the US knows they're behind and is spending, billions of dollars in the form of government contracts to enable the private sector to give them the capability to be competitive with the Chinese. The moon is very important from a strategic high ground perspective as a staging point to get to Mars, as a staging point to build out orbital data center constellations, and then eventually to also mine the moon for rare metals and minerals. That's a very exciting area. And then I think lastly is power. In space, you can really there's no grid to plug to plug in anything. So you're either doing solar or nuclear. And now with the AI race and the massive demand for power, it's become incredibly attractive area to invest in from a dual use standpoint, both for applications in space and then obviously for applications on Earth. And so I think small modular fission and fusion opportunities are incredibly exciting. So that's some of the areas that we're focusing on right now.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. So you started in 2020, so here we are 6 years later. Are
Crazy.
you surprised where things are at this point? Is it developed faster than you thought it would, or around the pace that you thought it would? And the follow-up question to that is, what has been the biggest surprise that has come up over the last 6 years?
Yeah. We try to operate kind of like with blinders on, chip on our shoulder, make us believe that, everything's going to fail. We got to keep going. And that's kind of allowed us to kind of grow the business and invest in these incredible companies. But yeah, taking a step back and looking
I
at
love
it.
no complacency for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We're, got to keep swimming sharks, I think, the original thesis was that dropping launch costs was going to enable, and I think will enable, a flourishing commercial space economy. And sort of the grand vision of this comes from kind of the ethos that Blue Origin is built on, which comes from a book written by Gerard O'Neill called The High Frontier, which is the idea that as kind of launch costs and prices come down, a launch capacity comes online, it will start to make more and more sense to move heavy industry off Earth and keep Earth zoned as kind of light and residential. And so you can think about like landfills. Why would we have landfills on Earth if we could just, launch all the crap into space and send it out to the surface of the sun to burn off, or move data centers off Earth, move manufacturing off Earth, move energy production off Earth, anything that has a negative externality on the sort of atmosphere and the globe. And I think that vision is still far away from becoming a true.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's a great vision, though. I mean, that's about as succinctly as I've ever heard that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think like that is the inspiration that space. I'm obviously in it day to day, and there's a lot of just like practical nuance things that you have to do, but to have that as sort of a guiding vision is inspiring. And I think there's the environmental community can probably learn a lot from the opportunity of space. Of like, you want to make space or the Earth truly sustainable, we're going to have to leverage space. And so I think that is the vision. I think we're probably still another 20 to 40 years away from seeing that in reality. We're starting to see the early days of that. But to answer your question more directly, kind of what has been the surprise and and we always knew it was going to take a while, but the surprise at how quickly things have gone as a result of kind of the national security side of space. And I think that we've talked about it internally, but we kind of call it the convergence, where you've had 4 or 5 different macro, disruptive technological and economic and geopolitical trends happening at once. So wars breaking out and defense budgets increasing and seeing the vulnerability of our national security supply chain, which resulted in a mass investment into sort of hardware and wrapping up our defense technologies. Then you have the new space race against the Chinese, forcing us to build out infrastructure and bring on capabilities that sort of compete with the Chinese. Then you've got national security leveraging space because of the increase of launch capacity and building out things like Golden Dome. And then you have the new AI race, which has created a new nuclear renaissance. And kind of these 4 or 5 macro events were all kind of operating in silos on different timelines. And what's been absolutely incredible over the last few years is seeing the convergence of all those taking place on the same timeline. And that has created such an incredible opportunity from an entrepreneur standpoint and from an investor standpoint. And I think as this plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll start to kind of see the long-term vision of space and a true space economy becoming more reality in the near term.
It's funny you said that about the economic impact, because as you were talking, I was saying to myself, this discussion is kind of what capitalism is all about. And the amazing thing is that as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about, the race with China. And the reality is that race, that competitiveness is making all of us ultimately better. And it's making us push harder, push faster. And that's, to me, that's what capitalism is about, is having that competition. And, ultimately the greater for all good, hopefully comes out of that.
We get asked kind of what's the biggest threat to the space economy. The biggest threat to the space economy is if the Chinese were to stop being competitive to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is, I mean, the ship has sailed in terms of,
like I mentioned a minute, complacency, you get complacent.
Exactly. And so we have launch, we'll get launch capacity online. The tech has been solved. We have nuclear, we've got power, we've got AI, but we need competitiveness to keep us going. And you can kind of trace the space race against the USSR and the development of technology stagnating to the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, I could see that. So now, as you touched on this already a little bit, but what's going to be the big surprise, let's call it 5 to 10 years down the road? Like, what would most common people have absolutely no idea may be in existence in 5 or 10 years that is not in existence today?
I think there's a lot of talk. I think like the nuclear renaissance is kind of now becoming a more clear reality to people because of AI. And I think that's less of a surprise to people. I think orbital data centers is maybe less of a surprise to people and the need for that. I think the big surprise will be I think not enough people understand how important and how much it is being invested in the lunar economy. And I wouldn't be surprised in 5 years from now to see humans on the moon permanently. It's not going to be the Four Seasons, but it'll be, infrastructure built out, mining, kind of sectors that we think about as kind of dirty and infrastructure here on Earth. That's where we'll be.
Very cool. Well, Daniel, what would you like to share with our viewers about yourself and your company, whether it's information about your newsletter or your fund? I mean, just open to you with anything and everything you'd like to share.
I appreciate that. I mean, Balerion has been, we're an investment firm, so our core focus is to find the next great companies to invest into. So if you're an entrepreneur, or if you know an entrepreneur that's operating in this space, would love to connect with them. We have our newsletter, News from the Cosmos, that's running weekly, sending kind of key updates about what's happening in the category. And then we've got a podcast, The Eye of the Dragon, where we kind of showcase the opportunities that these entrepreneurs are building and give them sort of a forum there. And then we're hosting events kind of all over the country and all over the world all the time, giving people an opportunity to to kind of see this and see it in the flesh and meet founders and other investors. So all that can be found kind of on our website and through our team. And, I'm sure we'll be able to add links or somewhere to connect them with
Yeah,
folks. But
we'll,
yeah.
we'll add the links. All right. Well, cool. Any closing thoughts? Anything else? Anything that I didn't ask, we missed that you think is good information to get out there?
Some people like to ask about aliens, and I have no good answer for them. so, so I'll
I
keep
was
it.
thinking more of the Jetsons myself. I was like pondering that, are we going to be like the Jetsons at some point, which you might not even be old enough to know what that is, but
Oh yeah, I do. I think no, I think we covered a lot. It's when you're in it and you see so much innovation around you, you're in the kind of the weeds. It's not as fantastic and doesn't feel as kind of, you don't feel the change happening in real time. But I think 5-10 years from now we'll see sort of like this was the golden era of the infrastructure build up of space.
yeah, well, I actually think a lot of people are going to find this discussion fascinating because I think to the average person, there's a lot of unknown about what's going on and why is this money being spent? Why is this infrastructure being looked at? I still think back, there's somebody in my office whose father was involved with NASA, sending people to the moon the very first time. And, again, that was such a monumental time back 50, almost 60 years ago. And just to think where we are today, and even using AI as an example, I mean, as a generality, probably 60% of the population may have even heard of AI just a couple of years ago. And to
Yeah.
think that is today, and, again, what's being done along the space frontier, kind of headlined by SpaceX and Elon, because deservedly so, they have a spotlight in that area. But there's, to your point, there's so much more going on and ultimately going to have such a big impact on all of our lives. I just find it very fascinating. I think a lot of other people will as well. So I appreciate you sharing your time and experience and knowledge, and look forward to seeing more.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'll leave everyone with this, that I think for those that have a hard time kind of understanding kind of the space and hearing these concepts, an alternative way of viewing the opportunity set is we are just moving critical infrastructure for national security, for communications, for data, and for power off Earth. And there's something called the Kármán line, which is kind of the separation of Earth and space. To us, there is no line that separates the two. It's just all one and the same. But yeah, I'll leave you guys with that. But no, I really appreciate you having me, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
My pleasure. I'll look forward to hearing more and keeping in contact. I actually didn't realize you sent your newsletter out weekly. Candidly, it seems like I get it more often than that, but maybe just time flies so fast. I do read through it every single time I get it. So I really have enjoyed it, and it's valuable information. So
Thanks so much.
all right, man. Thanks again. Good meeting you.
That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to Significance of Wealth on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also follow Tom Ruggie and Destiny Family Office on LinkedIn and destinyfamilyoffice.com for more insights on wealth management, private market opportunities, and collectibles. Until next time. The expressed views, thoughts, and opinions belong solely to the host and/or guests and are not investment recommendations or opinions issued by Destiny Family Office or its affiliates. Investment advisory services are offered through Destiny Family Office, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. The funds discussed are typically for qualified purchasers, defined as $5 million of investment net worth, exclusive of primary residence. Destiny Family Office podcasts are the sole property of Destiny Family Office, and information provided is for informational and educational purposes only. Learn more at destinyfamilyoffice.com/disclosures.